Okay, you can leave your computers for a while. I think we will get started. I hope I will give you something more interesting than what's on the screen. So we will talk now on about protecting your MySQL server installation and what to do and what not to do when you are installing and using a MySQL server. Okay, so that's a slide that says that you should not make purchasing decisions based on what is explained here. Okay, so the agenda. So I actually went in and downloaded the OpenSUSE release and did some analysis of the MySQL version in it and how it is installed and looked into some scripts. So that's what the post-installation situation is about. Then we will see how to improve that situation and some common sense things to do on top of it to make it more secure. Then more security is if you really want to invest into securing your MySQL installation. I give you some hints on how this can be done. And then I give you a brief overview of the security changes in the upcoming MySQL version. So the 5.7 is our current development version, and that's where all the new development is going. So if you want to track that, that's the place to do it. So that's why it's 5.7 here. Okay, so a little bit about me. I come from a banking background. I used to serve as an IT manager in one of the banks in my country. I've been doing software development for like 20 years now, I guess. And I am currently leading the MySQL Server general team. So we deal with security, we deal with performance analysis, and the client tools. And I've been with MySQL since 2006, so I've survived all the turbulences around the MySQL product, starting from this little Swedish company and ending in Oracle currently. And I've been speaking to a number of conferences, mostly on the Oracle events, but also on open source conferences. Okay, so let's start with SUSE 13.1 and see what is in it. So I'll start with the good news, and the good news are it is a very recent MySQL version. So 5.6.12 is only 5 update releases away from what we currently have on our website. So that's great. I mean, a lot of other distros are far away from that. So congratulations on that. I mean, it's amazing. And what you get by that is you get a very secure authentication plugin, SHA-256 password plugin. So that uses SHA-256 compared to the SHA-1 that the quote-unquote traditional MySQL authentication protocol uses. So SHA-1 has known problems and SHA-2 is better. So we have that in 5.6. We also have manual password expiration. So if you want to force a user to change their passwords, you now can. And that's a very good thing to have. We also have password strength validation and a plugin API for that. So if you want to implement your password strength policy, that's a great way of doing it. We also took steps towards eliminating the flaws in supplying passwords on the command line. I don't even want to go on why this is a bad idea, but it is a bad idea. So please look into the documentation 5.6 and see what the alternatives are, or think long and hard whether you need passwords in your scripts or not. It's another way of looking at it. We also have better support for SSL. We have certificate revocation lists and key files with passphrases. And we also better integrate with the SSL library, basically using its random generation APIs instead of our own. And we also obfuscate passwords in logs, which is something that, to my surprise, we weren't doing until recently. So now you don't get passwords when you do query logs, for example, or do backup binary logs and so on. That's a great thing to have. And there's more good news than that. The MySQL service is not on by default, which means that you have a shot of actually configuring it properly before it starts. So you don't end up with a running unsecure, widely open MySQL server. You end up with something that you can control. There's also a separate test RPM, which is great. I mean, all the test scripts and all the test setups are not in the thing that you install by default, with all their flows and their known ways to log in. Is it too small? I can try to then. Let's see if this would be better. Okay, probably not. There's no prepackaged database, which is great. I mean, these prepackaged databases, they typically contain a number of user accounts which are not very well protected, and everybody knows how to log in as these accounts. So it's good that it's not in that default installation. And there's no remote access by default. So you can only log in from the local host. That's great and a good way of doing it. But there are some not so good news. And the not so good news is the 5.6.12 version of the server. So this means that it is 24 CV reported security bugs away from our latest binary version on the web. It also is about 500 bug fixes away from the current version. So there's a lot that we are doing in our update releases, GA update releases, that users can probably benefit from. So it's a good consideration point here. And it also lacks the recent enhancements that we did to the AIS functions. So until recently, the AIS functions in MySQL could only deal with 128 bits keys, which is not a lot. It's enough for most of the things, but not really for all things. Say the CIA the NSA recommends that top secret things should be stored in encrypted only with 256 bits keys, and that wasn't possible until this recent release that we have. The other not so good news is that the MySQL secure installation script, or well, the equivalent of it, is not run on this installation. So traditionally, MySQL comes with a non very secure installation and then this script that you can run to harden it. And what this script does is it removes the root accounts. It puts passwords to root accounts. Random passwords. It removes the anonymous access to the MySQL server. So basically, by default, all users can log in, all users from the local system can log into the MySQL server and can do not very nice stuff to it. So it's not a very good idea to have that. It's really convenient when you start, but for production use, it should not be there. And there's no password strength checks. There's empty passwords for some of the accounts, and anybody gets full access to the test database. There is a test database, and anybody can create tables in it, and that's bad because they can, well, fill your database files and directories. And the other thing that kind of saddens me personally, because I've been involved into developing this tool, the MySQL config editor is not in the client tools package, which I find a bit strange because it's a client tool. And it's kind of central to our policy about avoiding passwords on the command line. So this is a tool that creates encrypted files on the disk in your home directory, readable only by you. And it stores host names, usernames, and passwords into these files, and in a way that the client library can pick up and use. So instead of specifying a password on your command line, you can store it in that file, and then care for that file at a central location, because it can handle a number of passwords this way. We call them login paths. So it can handle multiple login paths in a single file, and you have only a single file to protect, not a bunch of scripts spread everywhere. So that's why I would like to basically see it in the default installation, this tool. The other thing that raised an eyebrow for me was that the Federated plugin was installed by default. I find this a really interesting design choice, because the Federated plugin is known to have shortcomings, and that's why we have it disabled to begin with in our code. So I probably need to check with you guys what need do you see for this Federated plugin and how can we address it better. But I certainly don't think that this should be enabled by default. Also, the archive plugin, it's enabled on the configuration file, but it's not really needed because we compile that by default. There's no such plugin. So you get an error on startup by default, which is, well. There are some testing-only authentication plugins which I found in the server package. So these plugins are really dangerous because they can allow everybody to access the server without a password if one can create accounts with these authentication plugins. So they are great for testing because everybody knows how they behave and they are scriptable, but they are not to be in a production server, I think. Also, I would really love to see SSL certificates in the installation, even self-signed ones. There is a way to generate them using OpenSSL command line tools. It's pretty easy. We also supply some sample ones in our server distribution. So yeah, it's a good thing to have. SSL in general is. And also the secure file privilege configuration variables is set to null. This basically means that any user with SQL access can write and read anywhere on the file system, even remotely. So that's dangerous. That's typically I would set that to a directory that is a designated directory and restrict access this way. Because yes, you can typically trust the MySQL server and limit it through the MySQL account, but still it's, well, a loophole. Okay, and some more things. I mentioned this SHA-256 password plugin. It can fall back to RSA keys if you don't want to deal with SSL. So if you only want to strengthen authentication, but your typical kind of query exchange, you would like to keep it unencrypted, then you can supply a set of RSA keys to that plugin, and it will only encrypt the exchange sequence. And there's also no query logging by default. I think it's probably just me because, well, I'm from a banking background, but I believe that everybody should log stuff that they are doing. And that's not done by default. It's easy to turn it off if you don't need it, but I think it's probably a good idea to have it on. And also MySQL listens on all network interfaces. It only accepts logins from the local host, but it listens on all interfaces. So that's another small loophole that probably one can close. And speaking about SSL, I have a random, not so funny story. So this is actual MySQL server code. I don't know if you can see the yellow lines here. This one. So the first line is reading 4 bytes integer from the network packet. And the second line is copying into a local buffer data using that length and without checking it really. So the changes we did is the green part. These things. So we added those changes just to check these bounds and verify all these lengths and all of that. So it's I just wanted to reiterate how easy it is to be making errors like that. And no project is immune to such errors. So that's why I really believe that we should all be working on finding this. So yeah, that's my funny story here. By the way, this is nowhere near production code. It's one of the early 5.6 development releases, which got fixed before it got released as GA. But it's on Launchpad, so all of the history is there, and you can find that out there. Actually, this screenshot here is from Launchpad. You probably recognize the format. Okay, so back to our assessment. I would say that what you get by default in SUSE 13 is a development installation. So basically, it's not something that you can put safely in production. Maybe that's the purpose or that's the intent, but I'm just saying that it's not really secure by default. So how to harden it? Again, common sense. MySQL secure installation. It's called that for a reason. It secures your installation, so it's really good if you run it. I kind of run it. There's no harm in running it twice. So if you have run it already, you can always run it again. It will make no changes, but well, you will have the assurance that all these popular loopholes are closed. Also review and restrict the network interfaces that the server listens on. There is a port, server listen address, I think, in the config parameters that can allow you to restrict the interfaces you are listening on. If you expect to get your MySQL connections from, say, network card 0, you should listen only on network card 0 and no more than that. Also, generate SSL keys and make sure that the server can talk SSL. And I'm not saying that you should go all the way and enable certificate authorization and require it and all of that, but it should be there should you decide to use it. Because people think that it is hard to basically generate a set of SSL keys, but it is not that hard and can be done really easy. Actually, we are looking into providing scripts that will make that for you. Because it's not really a good idea to be shipping keys in the distribution. I mean, they have to be generated on the computer where the server is installed. And again, the easiest thing to do is to enable logging. There's a number of logs that the MySQL server can produce. There is the query log, there is the audit log API, there is an audit log plugin that we provide. Basically, logging is good and you should have it. And also make sure that you have a log backup policy. For example, our audit log plugin has this thing that whenever a file reaches certain size, it just switches to another file and leaves that file with the timestamp into its name. So you will need to have some sort of a backup policy around that so you don't lose logs when you need them. Also, make sure you remove all the extra user accounts and privileges. The test database is a great example. There was also a number of root accounts defined for different interfaces which were really redundant, and we removed them in 5.7. And also make sure that you don't ship files in the packages that you don't really need. Example being these authentication plugins. And also schedule regular backups. That's the simplest security tip that I can give you, but also the most important one. Backups save data. Okay, so I try to outline a few things that one can do at certain stages of using the MySQL server. So we start with the post-installation, post-application installation. So again, remove the extra user account created by the application. Remove and maximally restrict the grants that the application did. Some applications are really promiscuous. They create root users for no reasons, and you shouldn't live with that. Also make sure the user accounts authenticate using a reliable method. Some older MySQL applications are not really aware that there's no choice of authentication method, so you should, well, do that as a very savvy DBA. Also clean up the extra temp files left by the application. Some of these temp files and extra plugins and test things can be abused really badly. So you should make sure you have no extras in your installation. Also, make sure the backup covers your new application, because that's a very typical flaw. I mean, you have a backup system, you install an application and it's not backed up, but you don't know it. And also audit the server configuration for changes and revert the ones that you don't like. Your server configuration should be known to you. Applications should not really, well, abuse your right to configure your server. Okay, some tips for MySQL daily use. So keep your installation up to date. We regularly release security updates, and we typically disclose what security bugs are fixed in each release. It's important to be following that, because some of these can be exploited by malicious users, and there's, due to MySQL being so popular, there's a lot of script packages that automate that, so even not very savvy users can abuse those flows. So make sure it's up to date. Also monitor your server logs and security related statistics. We have a number of statistics that you can enable through performance schema and in other ways. There's status variables. You should make a good pattern of monitoring this and finding unusual things that are going on with your server. Also monitor the server configuration. Some of the most popular exploits deal with altering the MySQL configuration files. So monitor those. And also regularly probe your defenses by trying bad things on purpose. There are some exploit scripts on the wild. Try running them against your server and see if you are actually vulnerable. There's also the most basic common sense thing to do is to perform regular emergency drills. Make sure you can restore from a backup. Make sure you can checksum your data. Make sure that you can compare your data with some replica or something like that, and try that. I mean, it's one thing to know that you can eventually do it, and the other thing to have the muscle memory of doing it. And also set procedures on maintaining your user account base. Make sure that you have proper procedures on assigning credentials, proper procedures on rotating them, and, well, in general, tightening the security this way. Okay, so let's see what more can we do outside of common sense. So, the advice that I have to you is consider turning off TCP/IP if your setup allows it. So basically, there is a parameter in the MySQL configuration file that allows you to turn TCP/IP off, but it still leaves Unix sockets and Windows domain sockets on. So if you are running your web server, for example, you're only an exclusive client on the same host, then you don't really need TCP/IP. So why not turn it off? I mean, the less avenues you have to abuse your MySQL server, the better it is. And also, if you need TCP/IP, you make sure that you at least give a serious consideration at using SSL with it. Even self-signed protocols will, keys will do. So it does not need to be some expensive server certificate or something. And also make sure that you use SSL certificate verification. So your users can present a certificate to the server, and the server can request that they do by using this syntax: grant to require cipher issue or subject. That's part of your question. And also be careful with the directories that you give to the MySQL server. So temporary directory, data directory, this secure file privilege directory, where you can read and write your plugin directory. These are all very sensitive directories and a very common exploit points. So make sure you have good handle of this. And even more steps. Make a habit or automated alarms around your logs. So that means that you have to have logging on to begin with, but then when you have it, you can make use of it. And there's also things that you can do to go outside of the logging that the server does. I mean, your really sensitive data, you can create some automated triggers that track changes into them and use that as an application logic logging and so on. So there's a lot one can do in a way of logging. Also consider using external authentication. MySQL supports PAM, LDAP, Windows domain, all of these. And they have a very mature and very well-developed security practices around storing credentials. So you can just make use of them. And also, if you decide to do passwords inside MySQL and use the MySQL native authentication, there is a plugin that will enforce at least some password policy, like minimum password length, the types of characters in the password, and so on. And also, take a good and hard look into your scripts and try to understand why you need to use passwords in your scripts. It's a very bad practice and very insecure one. So we have a remedy for that. We have an alternative. You should, yeah? Login paths is something that we call these canned combinations of username, host name, and a password that are stored into this file by MySQL config editor. And then you can call it by name, like say I want to log in from MySQL command line utility using this login path.
Yeah, but what if I have a Ruby script? Can I use it from there? Or a Python script?
Well, we needed it platform independent, so that's why we created one. There's also a number of OS implementation of that, like the Mac OS password store. There is also a Windows password store, and probably gconfd can be abused for that too. So there's a number of platform-dependent ways, but we wanted our own platform-independent way, because then you can just grab your files and reuse them. Okay, since we are a bit out of time, I will publish the rest of my presentation online. So there's some concrete. Okay, then I will. So on this slide, I have some of the typical parameters that you would like to set when you want to make your MySQL installation more secure. So we start with secure file pref. That should be set to a designated directory. So basically that is the directory where the server can read and write as invoked through SQL commands. And that's, well, you want to restrict that, believe me. Especially the writing part. I've seen some very creative exploits abusing that writing part and, well, doing funny things with, say, the database directory and the FRMs, and it's scary. Also, symbolic links, there is a variable that says whether the MySQL server should follow symbolic links. I suggest you set it to no. It's safer this way. Also, the default storage engine, it's by default InnoDB, but if it's not in your config files, you should be really well aware on why it is not. Because, well, MyISAM has a number of problems, like, well, ACID-related problems, and InnoDB does not. Logging. I cannot stress enough how important it is to have at least some sort of logging for your server. And we actually have one built in, so you don't need plugins or anything fancy. You just turn this option on, and you get logging. And also, there is an option to control whether you want to mask passwords in your logs. It's off by default again, but you should make sure it's off. That's log roll. Also, skip networking. That's the option that I mentioned. This turns off TCP/IP. I strongly recommend that you should turn that to on. It's off by default, of course, if you can afford it. And also, SSL options. There's a number of them. They are all well documented. You need to supply some key material to the MySQL server in order for it to be able to run SSL. And those are a very good options to check and set. And the list goes on. Plugin dir. That's the directory where the server will go and look for plugins when you do install plugin. That's obviously a very sensitive directory because if people can write to it, then they can basically inject executable code into the running server, which is, well, scary again. So make sure it's well controlled, this directory, and set to a place where you only have the plugins that you actually want to have there, and nobody else can add stuff to that directory. There is also a chroot jail. That's very popular Unix technique of, well, protecting a file system. MySQL supports it, so look into it if you feel like it. Also, core file generation should be off by default. Core files have sensitive data into them, so let's not produce them on a production system. Okay, so the data encryption standard functions, encrypt and decrypt, they can operate with a key that's actually stored in a file. And that is much better than supplying the key as an argument to the function, because then the key gets locked into the logs, which is kind of, well, defying the purpose of encryption. So the MySQL server supports this des key file, and I suggest you look into using it. It's a good idea. There's also an option read-only. I know that I'm pushing it with this one, but I decided to mention it. So basically, this turns the MySQL server into a read-only thing. You cannot write data into it. That's useful in some places. And, okay, so the temp directory. It should be a designated directory. It should not be your regular temp directory. I've seen a lot of exploits that actually go and write into the temp directory the files that the MySQL server is supposed to produce and inject code this way. So it's not really a good idea to have it open for all applications. And it's very easy to just move it away from the default temp. So please consider doing that. Okay, and finally, 5 minutes, no more, on the new things that we've been working on for the last year and a half almost. So I will go by DMR, development milestone releases. That's what the abbreviation is for. Okay, so the first one was released on 23rd of April last year, and it contains audit log plugin that now works with Audit Vault. So that's part of the enterprise offering. We are kind of incorporating with some existing auditing systems that Oracle has. So we have that there. We introduced this MySQL config editor program. It has been backported to 5.6 since then, but it started in 5.7.1. Also, we have syslog option to the MySQL command line client. Some people would like to lock all of their interactive commands into the syslog, and MySQL now caters for that. We also marked the pre-4.1 password format as deprecated. So those of you that are aware that MySQL actually has 2 native authentication methods should also be aware that the old one is really bad. And it's time for it to go. So make sure your database does not have those short hashes. The next DMR, we require an explicit authentication plugin for all users. This is part of deprecating this old pre-4.1 authentication password hash format. So now we don't really support that duality. Basically, for some sort of a twisted convenience, it was the MySQL server was accepting changes into the way users authenticate based on the length on the password hash. So if you only store an old password hash, then you get a different authentication, which was weird. And we fixed that. And we also re-engineered the MySQL secure installation script. It's obviously central for us, so we took the time to rewrite it into C and make it better. We also deprecated the encode and decode functions, which are some old way of actually encoding, encrypting and decrypting data, and we have much better functions now. Data encryption standards and advanced encryption standard functions. So it's time for this to go too. And we also have client-side protocol tracing plugins. So if you ever dealt with ODBC logs, we have that now in our client library, and you can use those, which is nice. Client-side logging, you don't need to even bother with the server. Okay, the next DMR, it's we changed the meaning of the SSL option, --SSL. Previously, it used to be a no option on the client side. If you specify --SSL, it changes nothing really. Now it enforces SSL. So the client will refuse to connect if there's no secure connection to the server. So it's a useful option again. And we also changed how other SSL options work. Basically, they imply SSL, so you get a behavior which is compatible with what you have now, if you need it. But you don't need to specify that SSL option to get it. And we also have a proper connection state reset now, which is great. I mean, before that, if you are doing connection pulls, you were in need to log out and log in to just clear the session or change the user. There was an RPC for that, and undergo all the authentication exchange, which can be several packets. Now it's a single request response thing. It stays on the same user, but just cleans up the session as if it's post-login. So it's a good thing to have. The next DMR, 5.7.4, and that's the last one. We have our RPM packages that we distribute. They are secure by default. So basically, we have the effect of running MySQL secure installation into those packages. And we have separate packages for non-essential tools and utilities. That's, in a nutshell, what we changed. And we also have automatic password expiration. We introduced 2 new columns in MySQL users for that. So now you can say, you can configure per site policy, like change all the passwords every so often, or for individual users, like on a user per user level. And yeah, I mentioned already these enhancements to AES encrypt and AES decrypt. And I also added a random bytes function. Basically, this is an SQL interface to the SSL libraries, random generation routines. So it's a good thing to have for a secure installation. Strong random generators are always welcome. That's all I have. Yep.
I saw you protected your own RPMs now, but why is, if you just go through MySQL configure make install, why is that not in a state that MySQL secure installation gives you?
The problem is that the MySQL bootstrap is a bit twisted process. I mean, it starts with creating a directory, then you need to run the server in a weird mode, and then play a set of SQL scripts to it, which is weird again. And then you need to restart it in normal mode and complete the hardening of the installation. So it's multiple steps. It's not really doable in a single executable in a way.
Okay.
And the installation already has some of those, so we just pony up on this. That's why we do it there.
And the other thing is to monitor unusual patterns. Do you have any further pointers? Like, is there maybe Nagios plugins already that you?
Okay, well, we do have a full-grown solution, commercial solution that we offer. It's called MySQL Enterprise Monitor. They basically distilled all the support, wisdom, and knowledge that we have gathered over the years and encoded those into rules. So there is an agent that connects to your server and monitors it for certain patterns. And it would give you warnings, and it would give you different severity of warnings and so on. It's really pretty. But it's a commercial offering. It's in the Enterprise Edition. There is a free trial, so if you want to take a look, it's there.
You said that in your RPM packages, the installation is secure by default. How do you solve the problem with the password for the root user?
Okay, so the password goes like that. We generate a random password, we mark it as expired, and we store the random password into a weird file in your home directory. And so if you, when you log in, you need to read the password from there and change it. That's the way we do it.
So my question is far more simple than everything else. So for a simple user, I mean, I have a server that I play making web pages and stuff like that. How easy is for a simple user, not a sysadmin or something like that, to set up? I mean, I set a lamp at my computer and my home server. How easy for some simple user is to make this server secure? How do you think, from 1 to 10, how would you scale securing Oracle according to your competitors? I mean, do you, yeah, it's a bit twisted what I'm asking, but out of simplicity, most of people the past years use MySQL and they still think it's simple. But how simple do you think it is, reality check?
Well, if I understand your question correctly, you wanted me to compare it with some of the other popular databases.
Sorry. Not exactly. I'm saying, is it easy for someone without reading one hell of a documentation to do that with simple steps? I mean, can someone follow 10 or 20 simple steps and get to a point that it has a secure enough server to do something simple, not
Right.
bank or something like that.
So see, security is like plastic surgery, basically. The more you invest into it, the prettier it gets. So it's a process. You need to decide how much you can invest and need to be aware of how much the people trying to hack you will invest. So if you are guarding the royal secrets, you better invest accordingly.
That's why I told you about
Right.
simple web pages.
But if you are guarding your your
Blog, for
website
example,
visitors, for example, or your the email addresses of your commenters on your blog, then I would say that running MySQL secure installation should be a pretty good way of doing it.
Thank you.
You mentioned that OpenSUSE enables test authentication plugins by default. Was that correct?
Ships them into the plugin directory, which means that one can enable them with a single command.
All right. So it's not an immediate threat.
It is.
But all right, how would an attacker then enable those?
You
plugins?
create users that use these authentication plugins. That's how you do it.
All right, but I probably need elevated privileges in first place to create a user, no? I'm not knowledgeable. I'm asking naively.
Well, sure, but combine that with secure file pref, and then you can go in and write stuff into your database files.
All right. Well, wait for the mic, right? I'm interested in that. And even I cannot hear you.
The damping, the sound damping of the furniture here is extreme. You can't hear your word 5 meters away. In the case where you have the administrative privilege on the database to create the user, you don't necessarily care anymore about file accesses or generation of databases, privileges.
Ultimately, your goal would be to own the computer, in a way.
Of course, and control
Right,
it.
and to get there, you need to elevate your privileges. And when secure file pref is not set, then you can go in and write into your database directory, including your MySQL.user table. So that gives you elevated privileges.
Mm-hmm.
From there, you use the plugins installed into the plugin dir to inject code that the MySQL server will run.
Mm-hmm.
And then sky is the limit, basically.
On the other hand, if the secure file parameter is set, then the only problem remaining is that someone has the administrative privilege to create users.
The only problem that we know
Yeah.
about, yes.
About the secure installation script.
Mm-hmm.
After it's hardening your system and it's doing its job, it's possible to give us a list of weak points you may still have on the system, like the daemon is listening on all the interfaces, or you may want to use SSL. And the second thing, after you use the system for a while and you open some backdoors, by intention or not, it's possible to run it again and to give
Yes.
you another list of weak points you may have, like to help you hardening your system further.
Okay, so basically the monitoring part is again part of this MySQL Enterprise Monitor thing that we have. It would assess most common security flaws and it would give you the warnings. Basically, intelligence is something that people are supposed to pay for. And, well, it doesn't come free. I mean, it's experience and investment into understanding how the server works, so it's natural that people would get some money for it. I think there's open source tools. I mean, the log formats are well known and widely used. I know Percona has some tools that deal with the general log file and extract some wisdom out of it. But, well, it's what it is. I mean, it's not the core product, so.
Not only about the log files, but from the config files, for example. This script can look in the config files and can tell you weak options you have in your config file and just give you some advice.
Sure, MEM does that. I know for sure. That's our product that we center all of our intelligence into. There are competing products, but I am not really following them.
Thank you.
Other questions? No? Then I thank you for your time.